behalf of Her Excellency, Minata Samati Sisuma, Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian Affairs and Social Development of the African Union Commission, we are glad to take part in this inaugural edition of the World Kiswahili Day. The proclamation of 7th July as World Kiswahili Day by the member states of UNESCO during its 41st session in Paris in November 2021 goes in line with the United Nations Organization's initiative to dedicate a day to each of its official languages as a way of informing and raising awareness about the use, history, and cultures linked to these languages. Africa is largely a multilingual continent, and the African Union and UNESCO are both committed to respect and maintain this multilingual reality convivially, even as we seek a Pan-African language of wider communication. Both multilingualism and the idea of promoting a language of wider communication in Africa supports the linguistic expression of the African Union's political will, the will of the African peoples. And if the Lingua Franca project materializes, it will strengthen the African identity and linguistically assure the continent a place on the world stage. The language question of Africa requires looking at linguistic diversity and to assess how beneficial the Lingua Franca project is for African integration and development. In showing the urgency and necessity of the idea of finding one or two languages amongst the numerous African languages to elevate to language of wider communication status, and ultimately as Africa's lingua franca, for instance. The need for common expression for peace, security, and economic integration of Africa, and a common language in summits, negotiations, mediations, and discussions is obvious for Africa. There is also a need to have an Africa whose common language will allow Africans to communicate their needs, aspirations, and ideas. In order for Africans to support the weight of their civilization, to borrow Frantz Fanon's words, and in order to attain a Pan-African identity outside the labels of Anglophone, Francophone, and Lusophone, we have to shed off that old colonial skin. We assure you that we are not against any language. All languages are important and assets to the people. All what we are after, all what we are defending is linguistic justice and democracy. For the African people to use their own African languages, for the African children to learn in their own African languages that they understand best. The former colonial languages are partner languages for the African Academy of Languages, ACALAN. The African Academy of Languages, ACALAN, as a specialized institution of the African Union, mandated to develop and promote African languages as a factor of African integration and development, and to provide technical support to member states of the African Union for the development and implementation of language policies and strategies of language development and use, works considerably to promote Kiswahili, and therefore developed the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action June 2019 in Dar es Salaam, the United Republic of Tanzania, in collaboration with the UNESCO Regional Office in the United Republic of Tanzania, the Kiswahili Commission of East Africa, the East African Community, Kamishenia Kiswahili Afrika Mashariki, Kakama, and other partner institutions of ACALAN as a collective commitment to action by African governments to ensure that Article 25 of the African Union Constitutive Act, formerly Article 29 of the Charter of the Organization of African Unity, which states that the working languages of the Union and all its institutions shall be, if possible, African languages, Arabic, English, French, and Portuguese, be implemented. Subsequently, the heads of state and government of member states of the African Union, during their 35th ordinary session in February 2022, adopted the Assembly Decision, African Union Decision 796, which corresponds to the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action, to make Kiswahili a working language of the African Union and a language of wider communication in Africa. The recommendations of the consultations carried out by ACALAN and its organs and the working structures following the adoption of the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action by the African Union identified the need to organize consultative meetings in the regions of Africa and the African diaspora, to establish regional committees, and to determine implementation strategies. It is within this context that ACALAN organized the regional consultative meeting for the East African region on May 10 and 11, 2022, in Kigali, Rwanda. The following recommendations, amongst others, were made during this meeting, the implementation of which I'm sure will contribute to the promotion of Kiswahili. Embassies of Kiswahili-speaking countries, Tanzania and Kenya, for example, should set up cultural centers and promote the teaching of Kiswahili in other African countries to popularize Kiswahili. ACALAN's proposed Kiswahili Writers Competition, the prize for excellence for literary works in Kiswahili, should be implemented. Implementation and resource mobilization committees for the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action to be established. The regional economic communities, which are the building blocks of African integration and development, should take part in the implementation of the Dar es Salaam Framework for Action. ACALAN's initiative of Goodwill Ambassadors for each region should be adopted to support the resource mobilization process. Singers, writers, performers, celebrities should be included as assets for the fundraising project. The key activities for stakeholders overall should be to actualize Kiswahili's true role by July 2023. Kiswahili as a working language of the African Union and Kiswahili as a language of wider communication in Africa. To achieve the working language objective for Kiswahili, translators and interpreters should be trained. Baraza la Kiswahili la Taifa BAKITA and the Institute of Kiswahili Studies, University of Dar es Salaam, should collaborate with the African Academy of Languages, ACALAN, in training translators and interpreters. ACALAN should operationalize its Pan-African Center for Interpretation and Translation and engage the Pan-African University on the training needs for Kiswahili translators and interpreters. To achieve the language of wider communication objective, Kiswahili should be introduced in the African education system as one of the languages within the implementation of the mother tongue-based multilingual education program recommended by the African Union and UNESCO. ACALAN should engage in language policy advocacy to ensure all member states develop language policies that give status and valorizing functions to African languages and recognize Kiswahili as a language of wider communication in Africa. ACALAN should have the language plan of action for Africa revised for Kiswahili to have central role in it. Kiswahili is already a powerful factor of inclusion at local, national, and regional levels in East and Central Africa. Kiswahili is the lingua franca for a highly multilingual region of over 200 ethno-linguistic communities with a population of approximately 200 million people in the United Republic of Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and of course the African diaspora. Kiswahili is an important ingredient in fostering diversity and inclusion in the region, especially in the East African community, for regional integration and sustainable development. Kiswahili is used beyond the East African region. Recently, in the South African school curriculum, which lends credence to the great potential of Kiswahili to be used as a language to enable Africans to speak with one voice. Kiswahili is an African language, a Bantu language with terms drawn from Arabic and other Bantu languages, spoken either as a mother tongue or as a fluent second language on the East African coast. It has been one of the official languages of the African Union since 2004, alongside Arabic, English, French, and Portuguese. Kiswahili was adopted as an official language of the Pan-African Organization as part of the political will and efforts of African leaders to enable Africa to use African languages in Africa's development. This is one of the most important milestones and developments in the trajectory of Kiswahili. Interestingly, its adoption at the African Union was in part a seemingly innocuous development, but one loaded with huge potential for Africa. Kiswahili has a great potential as a language of wider communication in Africa, thanks to factors which include its strategic position, history, and structure.